In this ethical scenario, the problem conflict involves the therapist's initial interaction with me as the interpreter before the assignment begins, asking me personal questions about the experience of deaf people as a whole. Then the therapist approaches me to ask to speak privately while I'm with my deaf client who is trying to schedule an upcoming appointment. A few weeks later, I am given information about an upcoming group therapy and request a team who is unable to make it to the assignment due to an accident and no replacement is found. So I'm told to proceed alone, and it begins to have a negative mental, physical, and emotional strain on me and my work. I'm then revisited with the reminder of a past patient in group therapy. He's a man who has sexual fantasies involving young boys, and this happened when I arrived early at the Scouting Olympics. Then the man goes on to volunteer to drive and to be one of two overnight supervisors. Tenet 2.0, professionalism, specifically subtenet 2.5, refrain from providing counsel, advice, or personal opinions, is in question, as well as subtenet 3.3, avoid performing dual or conflicting roles in interdisciplinary or other settings. 3.7, disclose to parties any actual or perceived conflicts of interest. 3.8, avoid actual or perceived conflicts of interest that might cause harm or interfere with the effectiveness of interpreting services. Tenet 4.0, respect for consumers, facilitate communication, access, and equality, and support the full interaction and independence of consumers. Subtenet 3.1, consult with appropriate persons regarding the interpreting situation to determine issues, such as placement and adaptations necessary to interpret effectively, as well as decline assignments, that's subtenet 3.2, decline assignments when not competent due to physical, mental, or emotional factors. And lastly, Tenet 6, business practices, subtenet 6.5, reserve the option to decline or discontinue assignments if working conditions are not safe, healthy, or conducive to interpreting. All of these subtenets are at play. They overlap definitely throughout the progressive interactions that occur, but mostly conduct and respect for consumers is the primary subtenets that are most applicable to the situation, to where I would use to warrant my decisions that I will then explain in just a few moments. The expectations of the deaf consumer: they expect to be treated with the same access to information and communication in therapy, as well as the same privacy and respect other intensive outpatients receive, which includes relying on my professional conduct to remove myself from the conflicting roles of the interaction. The hearing consumer expects me to share my personal story and be the one to answer questions and possibly be an ally or mediator between hearing and deaf culture to kind of fill in the gaps. The interpreter is expected to adhere to CPC tenets and address those in question, make a decision how to best support the independence of consumers by transferring the responsibility and empowering the individuals involved by deferring the question made by the therapist to the deaf consumer. The interpreter also expects to have a team interpreter if the assignment is something other than just one-on-one therapy. The agency is expected to support the interpreter's decision of how to handle this conflict most effectively. Now, what I would do: I would establish from the start of the interaction that I'm simply the interpreter whose role is to facilitate communication, not be friends or step over professional boundaries for the sake of all parties involved. I would tell the therapist that if they were comfortable, they can certainly ask the deaf patient about the residential experience. However, it's not my place to interject myself in this patient's life or the mental health team's understanding of their experience. When he then requested to speak to me in private, I would make it known that as an interpreter, it would be unethical to leave my deaf client out of the loop because it would obstruct our trust and interfere with the level of effectiveness of my interpreting services. In a future assignment where I expected to have a team, but another interpreter was not available due to a car accident, I would let the head therapist know that being alone on this job is not beneficial to me or anyone involved due to cognitive fatigue and the high stress environment. I would first seek to request frequent breaks so as not to leave the deaf patient completely without any access at all. And if this exception could not be met, the physical, mental, and emotional strain would be too severe for me to continue. Thus, I'd withdraw myself from the situation. Upon arrival at the Cub Scout camp, I would most likely be triggered by the reappearance of the therapy patient with sexual fantasies of young boys, which is distracting to my mental processing while interpreting. Because of this, and having to adhere to confidentiality of the assignment, the therapy group session, and everything I witnessed, I would do the best I could to focus on interpreting for my deaf consumer and then request to be replaced and remove myself from the situation. As a freelance interpreter, it's important to note that I'm not a mandated reporter, so I would not overstep my professional role and take on another, like a protector or an informer, for example. I would leave that up to the people in charge of the camp and the mental health hospital treatment team. Some situational effects on all four groups include the deaf consumer feeling empowered and supported, being treated equally and given access to communication, the hearing consumer who feels educated on my role as the interpreter and the deaf experience from the experience of a deaf person. The interpreter feels like they're in the back seat again. They're not making decisions for anyone. The deaf person is driving the boat of information shared. The agency feels confident in my ability to handle the conflict without it escalating or involving the agency. Some short-term and long-term effects. The short-term effect on the deaf consumer, they now feel secure, and long-term, this builds the decisions that I made to reserve their and respect their rights builds trust between me and that deaf consumer. The hearing consumers' short-term effects, now they feel informed and unoffended by the way that I delivered the information that just needed to be brought to the table. And in the long term, the hearing consumer can proceed in their respective role as a therapist for my client. The interpreter in the short term, now I feel comfortable continuing to facilitate communication. In long term, I don't overstep any personal or professional boundaries. In the short term, the agency does not receive complaints because of how I handled the situation, and in the long term, they're not subject to scrutiny for any interpreter lacking conduct and performing conflicting job roles.